Well, welcome. I will start quickly, and I ideally do not want to take too much of your time. This, so caveats here. This is not really, it's called Tech Arena, but there's not much tech specifically being discussed here. But there is quite an important, let's say, wrapper around technology, which is governance of the technology that is built. And in our case, of course, it is Ethereum. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you get a different perspective of how governance works in our specific ecosystem, right? So the agenda is something like this. There is a framework that I will present for understanding trends. Trends can be whatever, it depends on how you process trends. Now, every ecosystem has participants and processes, and you will get a sense of what they are. I will define specifically what radical innovation means with examples in our history, not specifically Ethereum history, but the world's history. And then you can think about similar examples and you can think about radical innovation in your context, in your work. I will explain why we have infighting between governments, governance, and innovators, fast movers, trend catchers, and so on and so forth, why it is natural and why it is expected even, and why it is healthy to have infighting. And then I think that's the limit of the framework. I will just quickly, in a few short slides, explain the values of Ethereum Foundation and the idea of cultural pluralism and trying as an attempt to understand Ethereum's culture. These are things that I sort of picked up because I just have a fascination for politics in our arena, in our ecosystem. For Lido, especially, this is quite interesting, right? Because we're sort of tied to the hip with Ethereum. So it is sort of our mandate to understand how this space works in a much deeper sort of way. And I think the best way to understand things deeply is to have frameworks as guiding principles or some sort of a scaffolding or a structure. And so I'll quite quickly define what a framework means so that we are all in the same pace. A framework is just a set of interconnected abstractions that help us recognize patterns and provide structure to our observations. At least in this context, this is how I define framework. It's just totally a made up definition. There is no dictionary being used here. It's just how I think about it. And pace layering is an example of a framework that we can use to identify patterns within an ecosystem. In our case, it's Ethereum. So by the end of the presentation, what are the abilities, the superpowers that you will walk away with? Ideally, you will understand fundamental turbulence between fast-paced innovation and slow-paced governance, why they are fast and slow by design, and why there is turbulence, why it is fundamental to an ecosystem. You will sort of get an idea about it. You will be able to assess up and coming in fashion trends using your own personal extension of this framework that I am going to discuss with you. And by own personal extension, I will give you a quick, much later in the slide, I'll explain what that really means. And then finally, it's just a little bit separate topic, understanding the governing principles of Ethereum Foundation, and then a little bit of a sprinkling of culture on top, right? So these are the goals. They sound like lofty goals. There is no tech-heavy talk involved, so it should be very simple to understand. And quite a lot of this is hand-wavy. So fair warning before, if you were expecting me to give you much more technological talks, right? So this is a little bit more hand-wavy, philosophical, I would say even. So how did I come across this idea? So in February, we had this massive shake-up within the Ethereum Foundation. And so the ex-executive director, Aya Miyaguchi, under whose leadership Ethereum sort of went to quite great heights. She resigned from her position as an executive director, and she is now the precedent of the Ethereum Foundation. And quite a lot of this came with growing pressure from the community itself. So um, she wrote this blog post. I took the time to read it, and then I took the time also to read between the lines, because sometimes she comes from a culture which likes to uh, put a lot of context between the lines instead of on top of the line. So if you can look at this diagram itself, this is actually the diagram in the article. If you look at this drawing, you will see this book where Ethereum is. And then in this page, it says space layers. Actually, it's funny. Funny thing is, as I am speaking to you about it, I just noticed that this page says space layers. So this space layering concept was fundamentally embedded into the blog post of her departure from executive director. And that was quite interesting to me, because these are interesting principles, and they're guiding principles for Ethereum Foundation's leadership. Thus, if we want to understand them, we have to understand what these guiding principles mean in general. So, quite quickly, I'll set the context, the scenario, the scene for you. And very simply, lively ecosystems are always brimming with ideas. I mean, ideas are what make ecosystems lively, right? And I guess an evolving system or ecosystem needs to maximize value capture from changes with like as much value it can capture from these brimming ideas that are within a lively ecosystem. So fast fashion, emerging trends, rapid innovation, experimentation, they are ideas that are value generating, and they have certain good and bad, of course. And of course, an evolving ecosystem needs to maximize the value you can capture out of it. And obviously, maximal prosperity in the mechanism design, like utility, occurs when ecosystems can filter signal from noise effectively. I think this is just, it's hard to argue against this, even though it sounds very hand wavy, it's very hard to argue against this. And a robust ecosystem is an example of an ecosystem that can actually filter very efficiently successful ideas from froth. And for whatever reason, these new ideas are somehow guided by deeply integrated cultural values. And I will explain what that even means a little bit down the line, right? So uh, a robust ecosystem has short-term thinkers and long-term thinkers, and they're both necessary components. Short-term thinkers are the sort of Brownian motion in a glass of fluid, right? And you can think they're necessary. They're fast moving. They're fast movers. They're necessary for exploration, innovation, and just sometimes even like speculation. And long-term thinkers are the low pass filter of these kind of high frequency signals. And these long-term thinkers and short-term thinkers sort of exist in some sense in different they move in different temporal pace, and they live in different layers. These hypothetical layers look a little bit like this, right? So you have fashion, which is short-term, memory. It has very short-term memory and follows trendy stuff. Example is, the curves in cars, or another camera behind your phone, another whatever sensor. Commerce is the first mover, basically. It notices a fashion trend and it tries to capture value, maximize value capture from that trend. It's very short-sighted. It tries to look at payoffs as quick as possible. A simple example could be a fidget spinner company, like notices people are playing with fidget spinners. So it goes and starts, or in our context, the nth decks, perp decks, for example, they notice a demand for leverage, and they just create perp dexes. And the only difference apparently is incentives. So we have infrastructure. Infrastructure is a longer term endeavor. It is very expensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of coordination, but it has a very, very high payoff. And its core function is a good infrastructure provider notices commerce trends that are much more enduring, and tries to buttress or support commerce, right? And then these are sort of like the, let's say, these are like the faster moving layers in the scheme of culture, which is a product of nature, and these are much longer term processes or values, right? So culture is a product of nature. For example, nature, our human nature, which is an immutable programming, our human nature is survival, and culture is sustainability is a culture which is sort of born out of our nature to survive, to thrive, and then you can say culture drives fashion in that sense, for example. But we need something that is somehow all encompassing, somehow um, lives in the same layer as infrastructure, but somehow connects the culture and fashion and makes sure commerce is not going haywire. And that would be governance. It oversees infrastructure, it upholds culture, and it governs commerce. So this is how a base layering framework, it comes up with these 6 different layers that move at different paces and have different um, purposes. And the movement is very simple. You have immutable, you have slower, and you have faster. And I guess you could classify it in however way you wish. Just in the classification of pace, this is how I do it. Nature is hard to change. It's immutable, unless, of course, we start to change our nature by becoming cybernetic, for example. Then we have when we introduce entirely new programming. Um, so that would be layers. These are the layers. They're moving at different paces. And so how did so what is this space layering framework, right? So what is this idea that seems to drive the Ethereum Foundation, and where did it come from? So this is the image. It was created, I think, much earlier than 1999. Actually, this is just when it was published, I guess. But the person, Stuart Brand, he works in a foundation called the Long Now Foundation, and Long Now Foundation is like they're a group of long-term thinkers, basically hand-wavy sort of thinkers, but they try to look at bigger pictures. They try to think about in frameworks and so on and so forth. And the Stuart Brand, for example, has had many communications with the Ethereum Foundation. So they do have constant communications, for example, and they came up with this pace layering framework, and they were also inspired. And I will share the inspiration much later, but this is it, right? So this is the diagram. And what I like about this diagram is it is very simple. Once you look at it, you sort of get a sense of, you can sort of start to make your own story around it. It's so simple, and it's a crowning feature of this framework. It's very simple, and it's easily ownable and extensible. So who is the first mover in this ecosystem that I mentioned? And the first mover, whenever there's something trendy happens or whatever innovation happens, the first mover it's totally determined by the payoff, right? So in the case of trend-based commerce, commerce is, by the way, trend-based. So it is quick. They want very high payoff. They want to deliver high volume in a very short-lived time frame, maybe less than a year. I don't know where it is. And I will give you some examples. So one example, obviously, is fidget spinners. We all, I think, I don't know how many of you had it. I definitely had at least one, and it captured my attention for some total of 3 hours, maybe. I don't even know where it is now. But that's an example of commerce. So there was some company who decided to like, hey, this bunch of people are interested in fidget spinners. God knows why we were interested in it. It's just fascinating, maybe. Then we have meme coins, obviously. Although I'm always confused about meme coins. It seems to be a trend, but at the same time, it is very enduring. So I can't explain if it is really a trend or not. But nevertheless, what is undisputable is that meme coin launchpads are a trend. It's just commerce trying to capture as much value from retail as possible. Similarly, we have an example, which is something got sold for 69.3 million There was this NFT that was sold for that by Beeple. Extremely impressive sale. I have no idea why anybody would spend that kind of money on an NFT, but somebody did. And by the way, NFTs more or less are not, they don't seem to have the same enduring property as meme coins, which is also interesting on its own. You can probably have discussions about why there are such differences, but I leave that to you to have your discussions in some sort of a coffee corner in your co-working, right? So that would be quick payoff. But what happens if payoff is decades away? So this is a significant endeavor, significant investment, and uncertainty, significant uncertainty, and also significant risk. So what happens in that case? So an example of a payoff that is decades away is radical innovation. Now, radical is derived from Latin. It means root. It is very distinct from incremental innovation or disruptive innovation. And incremental innovation and disruptive innovations are sort of on existing things. These are innovations on top of an existing set of user base or whatever, you know. But radical innovations tend to have entirely new ideas, markets, users. There are no precursors, or there is just there are users, but they're sort of like the latent demand, you know, they exist, but they don't know that they exist, you know. So it's a new root of a new plant entirely. And one example is, it's actually a very interesting example, is, polio, right? So polio was, the funding for it was covered by a non-governmental organization, funded by the government, by the way. And this governance layer helped mobilize fundraising, for example, clinical trials, for example, education, and so on and so forth. And they did all sorts of, they basically mobilized the infrastructure necessary to get polio vaccines out and about in the public, right? So this is the same foundation, National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. I think the history goes like this. As far as I remember, there was this very famous in US president who had polio, who was in a wheelchair. I keep forgetting, Roosevelt. Yeah, Roosevelt. He had polio, he survived, he was unfortunately paralyzed. And when he became president, lo and behold, NFIP was created. NFIP funded the same people who discovered the double helix model, the same people who created the iron lung, which doesn't exist anymore, and so on and so forth. And they ensured that this vaccine succeeded. So that is an example of a, this is the kind of innovation that commerce couldn't take. They cannot take risks. There is no public infrastructure to ensure that's safety and so on and so forth. And in this case, there was some sort of a non-governmental public infrastructure, but it still couldn't ensure safety. So radical innovation has risks. And these are risks specifically only governance layers can manage. It's not possible that commerce suddenly becomes very conscientious and decides, oh, no, I should make sure that I don't botch this batch of vaccines, which is unfortunately what happened. So there was this Qatar incident, they call it, and there was another company as well. What happened was they didn't inoculate the viruses correctly, and the vaccines actually had live polio viruses that led to a lot of deaths, a lot of disease, and so on and so forth. And I guess this was the beginning of the first anti-vax propaganda. And in this case, you would say justifiably so, because there is an organization or a profit-seeking entity that has sort of bad processes has led to significant impact on the population. And I guess this is the crowning crown jewel of any anti-vaxxer. They're able to mobilize the governance towards regulating commerce, in this case, regulating vaccines and the clinical trial process and so on and so forth. This started to become much more important after this incident. So this is an example of how risks were taken by a governance layer, and risks manifested, and the governance layer accelerated its regulation of commerce. So this is sort of what happens, and this is an example of radical innovation, because before this, well, vaccines did exist, but public infrastructure for vaccines did not. And there are many examples similar to this. You can say the space race is an example of radical innovation. There were no marginal users of the space race. There were no satellite. The internet was an example of radical innovation, GPS, and so on and so forth. These are things that only governments and governance layers can mobilize on, because the yield is very, very high. The payoff is very, very high, but there is incredible, near infinite costs, and the risk-reward ratio is too low. And a funny story, a funny quote is, the first adopter of any kind of innovation tends to be the kind of person who's willing to overpay for a product that is underdeveloped. And the best person who can do that in this case is the governance layer, right? So that's the funny little quote in this. Now, I mentioned about, so these are layers. So if you go back into the image, I'm going to do a lot of this. You go back into the image, it sort of resembles some sort of a geological structure. And in any kind of fluid movement, there is turbulence. And between layers, there is also turbulence. And in this case, there is an example of constructive turbulence. So what is this constructive turbulence? So where does it come from? In principle, fast layers clash with slower layers. And you have some very interesting examples in the Ethereum and Bitcoin space. Everybody knows this. I don't have to explain this. It's just a feature of our. It's one of the interesting points of our history in our space. But well-functioning ecosystems has fast layer participants that understand the need for constructive turbulence with the slower layers. In this is a very interesting picture. You have Jeremy Allaire from Circle. He's basically saying, please regulate us. And this is around the time of Gensler, I guess, and regulations were non-existent. The government was not very receptive to crypto. And then these guys decided, okay, we need to elect a more constructive government. We need regulations such that the stablecoin can be much better assimilated into the financial pipelines of the US, for example. So this is an example of somebody who understands that there is a need for constructive turbulence, and it's necessary. But an example of a good example of an ecosystem or governance is when you have slower layer participants, so the governance layers, who decide not to be very rigid, and instead they are much more open to innovation. And in this case, I guess everybody has an opinion about the roll-up centric roadmap. But a roll-up centric roadmap is one of the best ways where we can sort of eliminate these block size debates and throughput debates entirely. And if you want your app to, if your app needs faster execution environment, just go to a roll-up. And this I think was very nice that it's something that Ethereum did. And I think it was one of the best things that we ever did. This is my opinion, of course. So you are free to have your opinion. Now, as with good things, there are also bad things. So example of destructive turbulence is, I think easiest one is what happened with Bitcoin Cash, right? So it was a rigid foundation. Bitcoin core developers and core proponents decided we wanted a pet rock. We do not want to embrace technology whatsoever. But the faster moving layers, like, hey, we are trying to innovate. We want more throughput. We want more block space. And this is interesting because around the time when this was happening, Bitcoin's blocks were sort of not full per se, but they were getting there. Or they're half full or 3/4 full or whatever. Today, of course, they're entirely empty, right? And a mutiny and exodus has led to our ecosystem. So I guess you could say that mutiny and exodus does lead to ecosystems sort of ossifying in that sense, but there is some sort of a cross-pollination that happens. So maybe it's net good, I don't know. So this is an example of destructive turbulence, right? So there is this shearing that happens between layers. Shearing is when two layers sort of move in opposite directions or whatever, right? That's just from geology. So the diagram that you see in front of you has very interesting historical perspective. This diagram was written or developed in the 1970s by this guy called Brian Eno. And by the way, this is the precursor to the pace layering framework. So the people at Long Now Foundation sort of spoke to Brian Eno, and then they built their whole thing around ecosystems and governance and the world. So what did Brian Eno discover? I think this is an interesting story because Brian Eno discovered that the site is immutable. You can't really change the site. You can change the structure of a building, but not that much. You can definitely change the skin, the facade. But what changes all the time is the stuff inside it. It's the space plan, the services, for example, elevators, dumbwaiters, so on and so forth, lights, etc. These things are constantly changing. So what Brian Eno discovered was the stuff that constantly changes is much more fashionable or whatever. And the costs that go into things that change more over time sort of grow so much that the cost of the site and the structure is like less than a third of the total cost of building. So Brian Eno and his friend or co-founder or whatever built a construction company that only focused on the faster layer. So this is an example of commerce trying to capitalize on a trend, right? So it's very interesting what happened. And then the Long Now Foundation saw it and like, hey, this can be applied on other ecosystems as well, other scenarios. So shearing is a turbulent process of exchange. And what is interesting is the propagation of force is direction agnostic, right? So you can have a nature guiding fashion, or you can have fashion guiding governance, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, lasting impact occurs when all layers are in harmony with one another. So for example, innovation that is driven by cultural values that are a product of nature, governance that remembers, upholds cultural values, and promotes infrastructure to support commerce, and commerce that via governance recognizes culture-driven fashion, instantiates the snowball effects, and capitalizes as a first mover, right? So this is an example of a harmonious interaction between layers. And I guess what is interesting is ideas that are very simple, they start to become ideologies when they're easily extensible, when you can own the idea, add your own ideas to it, and use it on your day-to-day as a rubric for understanding the world around you. And in this case, this is my personal extension. Nature drives culture in an harmonious world. Culture drives fashion. Fashion is detected by commerce, and commerce tries to capture it, and commerce is observed by governance. Commerce is also observed by infrastructure. In governance tries to monitor and control commerce, and governance tries to support infrastructure, which then supports commerce. And then this is the harmonious sort of harmonious exchange between layers, right? So this is my extension, my sort of how I see robust ecosystems develop. So with that, I think I would like to move on to the topic of Ethereum. And so now you're armed with pace layering. I will stop discussing about this hand wavy framework. You can extend it however you wish. I think it's very interesting. So what does the Ethereum Foundation govern? So what is foundational governance principles? And then what are the cultural values of Ethereum? Very difficult to define per se, but what I found was Ethereum Foundation. So very clearly, Ethereum Foundation is not Ethereum. Its values are different from Ethereum's values. Ethereum Foundation has these 6 or 7 philosophies: subtraction, long-term sustainability, thoughtful complexity, stewardship, adaptive growth, purposeful evolution, and community leadership. And what it is not, and this is very interesting, is minimalism, short-term game, etc., etc. These are values, and what are non-values that were born out of this turbulence between the fast and slow layers when people were telling the Ethereum Foundation to step up and be a mover and not a trend catcher or whatever. And then Vitalik came up with this goals and non-goals, and this funny thing. You can read his tweet somewhere. But I try to look for ideas about these different values, and I've found a couple of deep dives on this. Most of them are Vitalik's own essays. Some things that I don't understand really. I guess it's simple. We understand what long-term sustainability is. I don't know what adaptive growth even means. I don't know what purposeful evolution means. So these are words that they tell us, but I don't really understand it. There must be some meaning behind it. I'm hoping that the smart people at Ethereum Foundation know what it means, because I don't. But the other ones are much easier to understand. And actually, what is interesting is thoughtful complexity, where Vitalik explained the encapsulated complexity versus the other kind of complexity, which is very interesting. This is the kind of thinking that goes behind this multi-layer approach of Ethereum, where you have consensus layer and execution layer, and they're separate, somehow still interdependent, but they're still separate. So you separate the complexity and encapsulate it. So these are some values that they have. And then, of course, their goal as Ethereum Foundation is to identify gaps and imbalance across these base layers, as I mentioned, and their responsibility is in upholding Ethereum's values. And so I guess Ethereum's values are such an elusive topic, because I have no idea what it is. Is it censorship resistance? Is it gambling? Is it innovation? What is it? And I think the best person to really help you identify this is probably, again, Vitalik. And Vitalik has this idea where you can't really define values exactly precisely, because an ecosystem that is growing will have different values over time. But more or less, we have three kinds of participants. We have cypherpunks, we have regens, and we have degens. And I guess it's not the case that they are a distinct, it's not the case that you are either a cypherpunk or a regen or a degen. You have something, some combination of these three within you. Everybody over here at Lido loves the idea of privacy, immutability, open source. This is our values that we swear by: decentralization, so on and so forth, community. I guess largely we are regens because we care about community-owned infrastructure. And then, of course, I think it would be silly to not admit that we are also degens. We are we are first adopters, speculators, and trench warriors. And I mean, I'm a degen. I have a NFT PFP, which I overspent. I spent too much on. So it's just it's the cultural pluralism. So we don't really have specific values that are easy to define, but we have a pluralism in the kind of participants who bring their own values, and these values can change over time. And I guess this is what Ethereum Foundation wants to govern or uphold, And what is interesting is, and this is really something that, so the foundation really thinks about base layering, is that it says there's a reason why they focus on culture. And the culture is because it moves the slowest, but it provides a strong foundation for everything that follows. Culture endures far beyond market cycles, sustains us through winter, and propels us through spring. So this is an example so they really do think deeply about culture. Now, how they do it, how they go about executing, defining Ethereum's culture, that is a topic on its own. But it is something that they think about. It is something that is very relevant for Ethereum leadership. And hence, it's something that is relevant for us, for example. And I guess I would say, I think I've yapped for about half an hour, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. So I think that's it. I will stop my screen sharing. And I guess if you have questions, I'm very happy to respond to them. If you were expecting a technical talk, you didn't get it, I'm very sorry to disappoint you. And if you're expecting much more relaxing, thought-provoking talk, I hope this one did exactly that. So with that said, that would be the end of my talk. But if you have questions that you want to share right now, that's possible. If you want to do this to me directly via DMs, that is also possible. So I think I'll give it to Barbara and she can coordinate this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Firi.